And joining us now in Washington, D.C., yes, we do love the Brookings Institution today. Here's another senior fellow, Michael O'Hanlon, also the author of The Wounded Giant, America's Armed Forces in an Age of Austerity. Michael, it's good to see you again on the air. How are you doing tonight?
Fine, thank you, Steve. Thanks for having me on.
Appreciate you coming back on our program. What's your understanding of how much money the Pentagon needs to save over the next decade?
Well, how much it is being required to save by American law is becoming fairly clear at the moment. It's about $900 billion over 10 years. Now that's, as you know, in two big chunks. The $400 billion that was mandated back in August by the debt deal that was arrived at by the President and the Congress. And then, of course, the failure of the so-called supercommittee and the resulting sequestration, a fancy Washington word that I'm not sure has much use anywhere else, but of course means automatic spending cuts that are applied indiscriminately as previously threatened in the August bill. So if there was going to be a failure of the supercommittee, these additional second round of cuts would kick in. And the total there adds up, as I say, to almost $1 trillion over 10 years relative to what was previously expected, relative more or less to the inflation rate. So keeping constant spending constant dollar spending, in other words, steady, but then subtracting almost $1 trillion from that. That would be the current requirement.
So here's the setup for the next question, and that is military spending increased 35% over the past decade, and that doesn't even include the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, which are budgeted separately. Leon Panetta, the defense secretary, has been quoted as saying the Pentagon had a blank check basically after 9/11. So the question is, are these cutbacks really at all surprising given what's happened the past decade?
Well, I think the first round of cuts, the August round, is healthy. It's not just normal in some sense, but it's actually good for us because above and beyond the reduction in war spending that will happen anyway and that you and I aren't talking about today, but it's going to bring down annual defense spending by another $150 billion, above and beyond all of what we're discussing. Above and beyond that, the politics of national security in the post-9/11 era in the United States made it a little too easy for the Pentagon to fund all sorts of things. And I'm not just talking about weapons we might not need. I'm talking about things like making health care cost-free for military retirees who aren't even wounded. In other words, making that kind of military pension or benefit or perk even more generous than it might have been before. Now, obviously, we owe a lot to our men and women in uniform, but when you're talking about people who have already retired, you're not affecting the quality of the current fighting force or those who are going out and risking their lives in harm's way in Iraq and Afghanistan. So that kind of thing happened, frankly, too much because of the politics of defense in a national security conscious period of time. And I think cutting some of that back is going to be appropriate. Also, we made a lot of reductions and economies after the Cold War ended, but we are still sort of due for another round of base closures and command closures, issues like that. So I do believe that some level of economizing is indeed appropriate and healthy. But the $1 trillion, or the nearly $1 trillion in 10-year cuts that results from sequestration, when you add that on top of the August requirement, that's a bit much. I think that really gets into cutting muscle substantially and gets us into taking some pretty unwise threats and risks around the world that we really need a little stronger defense against.
Which is why you have written that you think the downsizing of the military, quote, must be based on innovation and efficiency, not retrenchment or disengagement. Help us understand a little more of what you meant by that.
Well, the Western Pacific, and by that I mean Korea and China most of all, as well as the Persian Gulf and the broader Middle East, and by that I mean, of course, Iran and the broader Arab world, and then extending over to South Asia. These regions are crucial. They're dynamic. They're becoming, in some cases, more threatening, in other cases, simply more powerful, as in China. They remain very important areas of interest for the United States and, frankly, for many other countries, including Canada as well. A lot of global economic activity occurs in those regions. A lot of nuclear threats emanate from those regions. Oil also flows from, of course, the Persian Gulf. And so I don't think that our interest in seeing those parts of the world stay secure has diminished one iota. In fact, if anything, I believe the trend lines are in the other direction. So I think what we have to do as we downsize American military capabilities overall is try to sustain our capabilities in those two particular parts of the world. And unfortunately, those were already the two parts of the world where we had the most assets. So if you try to sustain what you've got, and that already accounts for 80 or more % of existing Pentagon capabilities and budgets, it becomes a lot harder to cut back than people appreciate. That's what I basically mean. And by the way, one more word on China. I don't fear China. I don't expect we're going to have to fight China. But I think what you've seen the last couple of years is that China, as rising powers typically do historically, is feeling its oats a bit and trying to translate greater economic potential and capacity into greater military power and also greater foreign policy influence in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, in the Yellow Sea. And I think we need to simply sustain strong commitments in the East Asia region so that China doesn't get the wrong idea. If we do that, if we work with our allies in a very resolute and clear way, while also trying to improve ties and diplomacy with China, I think we will set up the right kind of foundation for a peaceful emergence of a Chinese superpower this century. But if we let down our guard, I think there's a risk that China will get more assertive as well.
Having said all that, let me read a chunk of what you wrote in the New York Times just last month on potential savings that could be found in the Navy. The Navy, you write, has figured out how to do more with less in the past. During Ronald Reagan's presidency, the fleet was double what it is now. But after the Cold War, seeing the writing on the wall, the Navy got more innovative. It based some specialty ships like minesweepers overseas and rotated crews by airplane to allow sailors a break without having to waste time bringing the ships home. It also chose to tolerate gaps in naval presence in some theaters, viewing consistency as less crucial to deterrence than before, and surging forces at unpredictable times and places instead. Where some degree of steady presence was viewed as necessary, the Navy sent smaller surface ships or large-deck amphibious vessels rather than aircraft carriers. So the Navy adapted before, and according to your piece, the Navy actually feels pretty stretched thin nowadays. So how do they adapt today?
Well, thank you. You hit on it with that idea of rotating crews by airplane, which, as you pointed out by reading the op-ed, we already do, but only for a very special category of small ships, these minesweepers, as well as for our ballistic missile submarines that carry part of our nuclear deterrent. We do not do it for the major parts of the surface Navy, surface combatant fleet, the cruisers and destroyers, of which we have, I think, about 85 right now, and which maintain presence in the Persian Gulf and the Western Pacific, and to some extent the Mediterranean, although that's been downplayed, and I think perhaps it can be downplayed even a little bit more. But frankly, what we do now, and you're probably aware of this, is that a crew always stays with its ship. So it trains up in American waters. First actually the crew is located, formed by different sailors who come from previous billets or from recruiting stations. They arrive on some base in the United States, typically California or perhaps the East Coast. Then they spend a fair period of time on classroom training, work their way up to ship training, do some short deployments in American waters, finally set sail across the ocean. They get to where they're going. They spend maybe 4 months on station, then they have to come back because the Navy doesn't want to keep sailors away from home for more than 6 months at a time. And then when they get back, of course, some other ship will have had to sail already to relieve them if you're trying to maintain more or less a steady capability in that part of the world. And you wind up needing, here's the punchline, 5 or 6 ships in the fleet to maintain just one on station at a time, according to current operational practices, because of this keeping one crew always with its ship. What I'm suggesting, and what the Navy already does to some extent with these smaller ships, is to rotate the crews by airplane. So that way the sailors still don't have to stay away from home more than 6 months at a stretch, but they do now have to share ships. They would train on one vessel in American waters, deploy on another vessel in foreign waters, and 2 or more crews would share 2 or more ships in that process. When you do the math, you can actually save, you can get maybe 35–40% more performance out of each ship and each crew with this approach. So you can maintain a certain amount of overseas presence with a fleet that's only about 2/3 the size. Now, I'm not suggesting you take that to the complete extreme, because we do need an attrition reserve if we wind up in war and lose some ships. We need some other added capabilities. So I'm suggesting that these kinds of ships can be cut by maybe 10 to 15%, not 30 to 35%. And we still maintain the same capability for forward presence that we had before. It's going to go against a lot of Navy culture and tradition, but I think we can do it, and these kind of economic times require that kind of uncomfortable change.
Okay, that's your view. Let me get you now to comment on a view expounded by Robert Kaplan in the Financial Times last month when he wrote, The financial world is obsessed with stock market gyrations and bond yields, but the numbers that matter in the long run are those of U.S. warships, which is responsible for globalization as we know it. In the 1980s era of high Reaganism, the U.S. Navy boasted close to 600 warships. In the 1990s, following the collapse of the Berlin Wall, that number fell to about 350. The U.S. Navy's current strength is 284 warships. Over time, however, it may fall to about 250. There is a big difference, he says, between a 346-ship U.S. Navy and a 250-ship Navy. The difference between one kind of world order and another. So do you agree with Kaplan that a smaller U.S. Navy in some respects is a threat to our way of life?
Well, first of all, he's done a nice job of summarizing the numbers, and he's a very good writer and analyst. But no, I don't agree with him. I think that he has not factored into his analysis the kind of idea that I just put forth. He's assuming the Navy continues to operate the same old way, which means if you go to a smaller fleet, you have less presence. Now, I admit, at some level, less is less. And if you go to a 250-ship fleet, which is about what I would advocate, you are going to wind up for certain scenarios with less capability. If you wind up in a long war against China and you lose 10 or 20 or 30 ships, you would have preferred to start that war with 350 ships rather than 250. I acknowledge that. But I don't think a war against China is really our most plausible or pressing concern. I think it's maintaining the kind of presence for routine deployments and crisis response in the broader Persian Gulf, Indian Ocean, Western Pacific. And that you can do with 250 ships if you go to this different means of rotating crews by airplane. So that's where I think that Kaplan's big picture is correct, but he hasn't factored in the possibility of operating the fleet more efficiently. That's where I try to come in at a somewhat more detailed level of analysis, and I think with a smaller fleet you can get that same crucial capability for that part of the world if you change your basic MO.
Okay, we have heard how the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have helped transform the Pentagon's focus from sort of fighting and planning big land wars to fighting smaller and more nimble insurgent enemies. Do you think that will still be the case going forward?
Well, I don't know. And one thing I try to avoid in my book or in my previous writings is to be too prescient, to claim I have too good of a crystal ball. I haven't found my own ability to predict the next war any better than the other analysts in Washington who collectively failed to predict Afghanistan, for example. And so it's pretty hard to be confident. I think, therefore, you've got to retain a portfolio of capabilities. What I would recommend now for the ground forces is that instead of planning on two major regional wars at the same time, which is pretty much what we've been doing for the last 20 years since the Cold War ended, that at this point, with Saddam Hussein gone, and with more of our threats maritime in nature, that I think planning for one major theater war of a ground combat variety, plus two sustained stabilization missions done as part of coalitions, hopefully with Canada part of each of them as well, that's the right planning framework. So I go away from two major regional wars, and I go to what I call a 1+2 planning paradigm, one major regional war plus two smaller stabilization missions. And I think that allows for the kind of uncertainty that we still have to acknowledge is real in today's world, where there are a number of problems in the broader Middle East in particular that could involve the need for stabilization forces through multinational coalitions, and where we still have challenges like Korea that, in a worst case, could lead to a traditional high-intensity ground combat operation. So that's where I wind up there. Again, I'm willing to push a little bit beyond the traditional comfort zone of American strategists, but I'm not trying to be reckless. I'm trying to be a little bit cautious at the same time I do that and acknowledge we haven't gotten any better at predicting the future than we used to be.
Okay, about 3 minutes to go here, and I want to hit on two more things. First of all, the uptick in drone wars and the really significant use of drones in fighting wars nowadays. How significant a part of a new sort of trimmer Pentagon do you think that plays?
I think it's important. I think, for example, and to be succinct since, as you say, we're running out of time, right now the U.S. Air Force has something like 18 tactical fighter combat wings. A wing is typically about 70 operational aircraft. And the Air Force hasn't really factored unmanned combat vehicles or drones into that traditional force structure. And what I'm suggesting is not that we replace the larger part of the Air Force with drones, but that we acknowledge drones can now do some things, especially in relatively non-hostile or non-advanced theaters against relatively unadvanced enemies, And we should acknowledge that, and we can accept maybe 15 wings of manned fighter aircraft and replace the other 3 with these drones. The Air Force really hasn't gotten to that point in its force planning. I think it's overdue, time that we do so.
And Michael, the last question I have for you is, the title of your ebook is The Wounded Giant. Why is America a wounded giant right now?
Well, as our good friends to the north know, we've had a tough decade. A lot of people have had a tough decade, I reckon, but we've fought 2 very difficult wars. Canada's had a very real experience fighting one of those itself, and I continue to admire and appreciate the amazing Canadian role in Afghanistan. But we've been through this now twice in Iraq and Afghanistan. We've gone into debt, a couple $1 trillion as a result. We've seen our image around the world substantially blemished. Even Barack Obama, with all that he signified and how popular he was, especially upon election, hasn't sustained our reputation or our popularity in the broader Middle East in his time in office. We've seen our politics at home become a little bit more dysfunctional and more divisive. And most of all, we now have 3 straight years of $1 trillion deficits, which are going to erode our ability to invest properly in our nation's longer-term economic future and risk our status, essentially, as the world's preeminent superpower. Now, I have no problem seeing China rise as long as the rise is at a pace where the Western alliance system is still pretty strong and able to remind China that, in fact, we have capabilities that it shouldn't want to challenge, and the rise should occur within a peaceful construct. But I think we're at risk of losing our ability to convey that message and to hold together our global alliance system with the state of our economy and our deficit. So we're very much wounded, not so much in the sense of being powerless today, but in the sense of our longer-term prospects being very much at peril. We've got to get our economy and our deficit back in shape, or our long-term power, I think, will be compromised, and probably within a decade, if not even sooner.
Next time you come back on the program, I want to find out whether or not the patient's going to die of the wounds or the wounds are going to heal. Michael O'Hanlon, thanks so much for joining us on the line from Washington. Appreciate your time tonight.
It's my pleasure.